Good morning and welcome to today's Congressional-Executive Commission on China hearing on forced labor, mass internment, and social control in Xinjiang. In the last year, Chinese authorities have expanded their network of mass internment camps, where 1 million or more Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims have been detained and subjected to torture, extended solitary confinement, and political indoctrination, and deprived of food. Children of detainees are reportedly often placed in orphanages, welfare centers, and boarding schools. Some scholars and human rights groups argue that these practices may amount to crimes against humanity. Outside the camps, the Chinese government has become more efficient in the use of technology to control and suppress. Some observers have described the surveillance system as an open-air prison. Recent reports indicate that Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims are increasingly sentenced to lengthy prison sentences on vague charges. One case is that of Uyghur scholar Ilham Tohti, who is serving a life sentence in spite of his dedication to nonviolence and reconciliation. He is a Defending Freedoms Project prisoner of conscience, and his congressional advocate is Representative Jim Langevin of Rhode Island. Meanwhile, the practice of Islam has also been criminalized. Mosques have been destroyed, Islamic dress has been forbidden, and fasting for Ramadan has been disallowed. And it is in this context that new information has come to light, detailing the widespread use of government-subsidized and large-scale system of forced labor in both mass internment camps and in factories throughout Xinjiang. Satellite imagery, personal testimonies, and official documents indicate that detainees in camps and some who have been released are forced to work in food, textile, and other manufacturing jobs. Products reportedly produced with forced labor include textiles such as yarn, clothing, gloves, bedding, and carpet, electronics including cell phones and computers, food products, shoes, tea, and handicrafts. In January 2019, the U.S. company Badger Sportswear stopped importing clothing following reports that it was made with forced labor by internment camp detainees. In May 2019, the Wall Street Journal linked the supply chain of Adidas, Campbell's Soup, H&M, Kraft Heinz, Coca-Cola, and Gap Inc. to forced labor. On October 1st, U.S. Customs and Border Protection issued a withhold release order on garments produced with prison or forced labor by Hutian Taida Apparel, which has exported products to Costco. Current U.S. law prohibits the import of any product made with forced labor. Any U.S. or international company that produces or has a supply chain in Xinjiang may be complicit with forced labor and human rights violations. In 2002, China ratified the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. The ICESCR affirms the rights of all peoples to self-determination and non-discrimination, to freely choose and accept work, to enjoy just and favorable conditions of work, including the right to remuneration, and to take part in cultural life. All of these policies and practices I have just described violate the ICESCR as well as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. China is failing to comply with international human rights obligations it freely assumed. There is no question that the U.S. should be doing more to help the Uyghur people. In April, Senator Rubio and I and over 40 members called for global Magnitsky sanctions against Shen Guo, the Xinjiang Communist Party secretary, as well as Chinese officials and companies complicit in gross violations of human rights. And last week, we expressed support when the administration added 28 Chinese companies to the entity list and applied visa restrictions on some Chinese officials. Right now, there are important bills in Congress that should pass, including the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act by Senator Rubio, Representative Swazi, and Representative Smith, and the Uyghur Intervention and Global Humanitarian Unified Response Act by Chairman Brad Sherman. I look forward to hearing any and all recommendations about what more can and should be done, including whether it is feasible for companies to conduct reliable inspections and audits of supply chains in the region. Congress stands in solidarity with the Uyghur people, and we want to do all we can to support the full exercise of their human rights. Finally, before I begin, I would like to, I'm not sure if he's here yet, recognize Nuri Tayyip, who is here with us today. His brother, Tosh Polat Tayyip was the president of Shin Jang University and is a renowned scholar. Tosh Polat Tayyip was disappeared in March 2017 and was sentenced to death with a 2-year reprieve. Last month, we learned from Amnesty International that he may have been executed. I condemn his detention in the strongest possible terms and call on the Chinese government to release him immediately. And I want to, having said that, I'm now happy to yield to the co-chair of the commission, Senator Rubio, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is an important hearing, and thank you for convening it. It's also timely. I also want to thank all of our witnesses. Your research and your advocacy have done a lot to inform us and the world about what's happening, the atrocities being committed in the Xinjiang region by the Chinese Communist Party. You know, through the decades, the crimes of the Chinese Communist Party have been as consistent as they have been egregious. Yet somehow these tyrants maintain the ability to shock the world even further with their cruelty and their callousness. The Xinjiang Uyghurs Autonomous Region in the last 2 years has experienced the classic forms of communist totalitarianism combined with the application now of new and advanced technologies. The difference between the Chinese Communist Party's crimes of the past and those of the present is the motivation. The past was about power alone. The present is now about both power, but also about profit. Chairman Xi Jinping and his henchman, Chen Guo, who, by the way, used to oversee Chinese brutality and repression inside of Tibet, so he's a specialist at this, revived collectivization to force Uyghurs into the harness of the Chinese party state. Just as collectivization created famines that harmed millions in China, this new effort is blazing a trail of human suffering. The problem goes much deeper than simply 1 million or more Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities detained in what can only be called concentration camps and who are forced to labor there. For those able to escape the camps, they face the full power of the Chinese party state mobilized against them and their families inside and outside of China. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Uyghur men and women have been forced through a regimen of military discipline and political re-education in preparation to take jobs in satellite factories. The Chinese Communist government offers incentives for Chinese companies to exploit this labor as the cost of doing business in coastal provinces rises. And what of the families and the children and the elderly? They're removed from their families' care so the adults can work in the factories. Instead of the warm embrace of their families, the young and the elderly are forced into the stifling custody of the Chinese Communist Party. For the children, this means the loss of their language, their culture, their faith, their heritage. For the elderly, this means loneliness and isolation in their final years. Their children and grandchildren will never hear the stories of lives well lived, of hardships conquered, or the importance of faith and values in a brutal communist-governed world. Today's hearing, however, is not about this alone. It is about understanding how the party integrates labor and social control and the national security and moral risks for individuals and companies that deal with China. The network of detention facilities and factories has turned Xinjiang into a forced labor camp roughly the size of the states of California, Montana, Texas, and Florida combined. Millions of Uyghurs and other predominantly Muslim ethnic minorities labor in textile and light manufacturing and are prohibited from practicing their faith. Simply put, this is slavery, the slavery of socialism, with Chinese characteristics. Earlier this month, the Trump administration announced sanctions, as the chairman said, targeting Chinese officials as well as governmental and commercial entities for these severe human rights abuses, and I believe these also constitute crimes against humanity. We all welcome these steps. We also believe more can and should be done to resolve one of the world's greatest ongoing tragedies and to hold accountable its perpetrators. I hope the House will soon pass Senate Bill 178, the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act that the Senate passed last month. The bill would require the administration to gather information about the situation in Xinjiang and China's efforts to suppress international awareness of it. China's efforts to silence Uyghurs and turn the world's attention away from the ongoing atrocities in Xinjiang have included the coercion and the intimidation of American citizens and residents here and abroad. This is an outrage that must be addressed. The U.S. government needs to do its part to ensure Americans and the world are aware of what the Chinese government is doing in Xinjiang and have the freedom to express it. Despite the efforts of our witnesses today, Americans and American companies in particular are all too unaware of what is taking place. For example, the National Basketball Association maintains a residential training camp in Xinjiang, which seemingly oblivious to the contradiction between speaking out about societal issues here at home, which they have the full freedom to do, but yet staying silent about China's oppression. Only after the U.S. Commerce Department added the Chinese artificial intelligence company SenseTime to the entity list last week for its role in facilitating all these crimes did MIT begin to review its relationship with the firm. So it's long overdue for Americans and important institutions and academia and the private sector to wake up and to fully realize the real risks of doing business with China. So I thank all of you again for being here today. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much. I'm going to yield briefly to any of my colleagues who want to make an opening statement. Mr. Smith.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Mr. Chairman, for the past 2 years, the Commission has shined a bright light on the massive, outrageous human rights abuses occurring in Xinjiang region of China. To that end, I, joined by my good friend Tom Swazi, introduced the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act of 2019, H.R. 649, with 110 co-sponsors, and the companion bill, as Senator Rubio has pointed out, has already passed the Senate, so I hope we take that up immediately. We have used our congressional platform to advocate for actions on this commission and to hold Chinese businesses and officials accountable for crimes against humanity. I commend the administration for speaking out about dire human rights abuses over the past year, particularly Secretary Pompeo and Vice President Pence. I also applaud the actions taken just last week to restrict visas for certain Chinese officials and to place 28 Chinese governmental bodies and businesses on the Commerce Department's entity list. Of course, more needs to be done. We should also be looking at really aggressively using the Magnitsky sanctions against individuals because this is absolutely outrageous. And matter of fact, we talk about crimes against humanity. This is genocide. They are trying to destroy the Muslim Uyghurs, they being the Chinese dictatorship, and we need, and the world needs to do far more than we have done to date. The world cannot remain silent when the Chinese government conducts a high-tech police state whose goal is the destruction of the entire ethnic minority population, and they're using every means at their disposal to do so. I would point out, we talk about how they're using gulags and forced labor. That has been a staple, as we all know, of the Chinese dictatorship's exploitation for decades. I actually, after Tiananmen Square, joined Frank Wolf. We went and visited Beijing Prison Number 1, where the activists, 40 of them that were there that we knew of, that were on the Tiananmen Square asking for democracy, were making jelly shoes and socks in Beijing Prison Number 1 for export. So this is just part of their apparatus that is now gone into hyperdrive as they extend it to the people of Xinjiang. So we need to speak out. I believe that more countries, especially those with Muslim leaders, need to speak out more aggressively than they have. The OIC has done some, but it needs to do more. And the world and the UN, all of us need to coalesce around this has to stop. This is a genocide.
Thank you very much. Senator Young? Opening.
Well, I thank you for holding this hearing. It's important to be here today. This strikes me as modern-day slavery, consistent with China's disregard for all manner of human rights. Here, you know, the basic dignity and freedom of all the individuals has been undermined, and it appears they are being persecuted in part by their faith. It strikes me that the United States is standing up for the Muslim world during this time, which is really important as we stand up for the freedom of religion of all peoples. And I think it's a really important time to hold this hearing. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll have some more questions later.
Okay, thank you very much. And Mr. Swazi, okay, all right. Well, thank you. And I'm now pleased to introduce our esteemed panel of expert witnesses this morning. Adrian Zenz is a non-resident senior fellow in China Studies at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. Dr. Zenz has done pioneering work documenting the scope of mass internment camps by analyzing Chinese government procurement documents, construction bids, and domestic security budgets. He's also helped document the mass institutionalization of children whose parents have been detained in mass internment camps and the incentives offered to Chinese manufacturers to employ forced labor. Nuri Turkil is an attorney and serves as chair of the board for the Uyghur Human Rights Project, a research and advocacy organization that he co-founded in 2004. He has published commentaries on policy and legal matters in publications such as the Wall Street Journal and Foreign Policy. Born and raised in Kashgar, Mr. Turkle has received his law degree from American University. He is the first U.S.-educated Uyghur lawyer and is a fluent speaker of Uyghur, Chinese, and Turkish. Michael Posner serves as the Jerome Kohlberg Professor of Ethics and Finance at NYU's Stern School of Business. He is the director of the Center for Business and Human Rights at the school, the first ever human rights center at a business school. Prior to joining NYU Stern, Mr. Posner served in the Obama administration as Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. As a member of the White House Parallel Industry Partnership Task Force in the mid-90s, he helped found the Fair Labor Association, an organization that brings together corporations, local leaders, universities, and NGOs to promote corporate accountability for working conditions in the apparel industry. Amy Lair is the director of the Human Rights Initiative, HRI, at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Ms. Lair leads the initiative's work on human rights around the world, with a particular focus on how technology affects human rights, labor rights, and the importance of a values-based foreign policy. Ms. Lair's core expertise is in the area of business and human rights. She spent a decade in private practice advising companies and international institutions on how they can respect human rights in their global operations, and previously she served as legal advisor to the UN Special Representative on Business and Human Rights, John Ruggie, and in that role helped develop the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. So thank you all for being here, and Mr. Zenz, we will begin with you.
Salam, and thank you for having me today. In 2017, China's Xinjiang region embarked on the probably largest incarceration of an ethno-religious minority since the Holocaust. Despite international criticism, Beijing has persisted in this campaign. The reason for this is now clear. All along, there was a long-term strategy behind it. What I'm presenting today is in a number of ways more shocking than the re-education campaign itself. It is more long-term, more all-encompassing, more intrusive, and more devious. Within this grand scheme, the camps only represent one piece of an entire puzzle. Beijing's long-term strategy in Xinjiang is predicated upon a perverse combination of coercive training and labor, intergenerational separation, and complete control over family units. Much of this is being implemented under the heading and guise of poverty alleviation. In my research, I've identified 3 schemes by which the state seeks to place the vast majority of minority adults into different forms of coercive or at least involuntary labor. Flow 1 pertains to persons in vocational training internment camps. Camp detainees can end up in factories, on internment camp compounds, in industrial parks, which can be located near camps, or the camps in them, or village satellite factories. The employing companies receive a 1,800 Chinese yuan state subsidy for each internment camp laborer they train, 5,000 yuan for each they employ, and a shipping cost subsidy of 4% of their sales volume. In 2018, XUAR Corporation, which operates the world's largest dyed yarn production in Xinjiang, received $500 million Chinese yuan, or 71 million US dollars, in subsidies from the Xinjiang government. This means that Beijing is now turning its internment campaign into a business of oppression, where participating companies benefit not only from huge government subsidies, but also from cheap minority labor. As a result, they will be able to undercut global prices and turn made in Xinjiang into a multi-billion-dollar business model. In one document, a company was promised the free use of factories. The government paid for 2/3 of the upfront investment cost and provided 500 internment camp laborers with accompanying police guards. The factories came with security equipment pre-installed and are being run in a semi-military style management fashion. In 2018, several Uyghur counties established large factory compounds explicitly designed to employ internment camp labor. One county alone commissioned a factory park with 335,000 square foot of floor space to be constructed directly on an internment camp compound, providing forced labor for 1,560 camp detainees. Flow 2 in this scheme pertains to a vast government scheme that puts hundreds of thousands of so-called rural surplus laborers into centralized training lasting between 1 and 3 months, involving 1 month of military drill in order to produce standardized behavior, 1 month of political thought indoctrination, and 1 month of vocational skills training. Workers are then sent off to their new work destination in large groups and live in factory dormitories, often far from home. This process might not be as coercive as internment camp labor, but it shares many similar features, indicating a high degree of coercion. Flow 3 places rural Uyghur women into village factories equipped with nurseries for infants as young as a few months old. Uyghur women are traditionally resistant to full-time work because they care for the elderly and children. Government village work teams have been working overtime to quote-unquote convince these women and their parents of the benefits of full-time factory labor. Government documents note that factory work transforms women away from traditional customs and backward thinking and propels them into modernity. One propaganda text on Uyghur women in a textile factory states that the process of de-extremification causes minority workers to become quote-unquote born again. The Chinese term here used for born again is the same as in the Chinese Bible, where Jesus says you must be born again. Forced labor is equated with salvation. A particular concern is that all of these labor flows are mixing beyond recognition. Graduates from internment camps now work alongside workers from flows 2 and 3. Products made by any combination of these workers are then either directly exported or shipped to Eastern China, where they may form components of products or be repackaged, relabeled, and then exported. As a result, many or most products made in China that rely at least in part on low-skilled, labor-intensive manufacturing can contain elements of involuntary ethnic minority labor from Xinjiang. My findings call for a global investigation of supply chains involving any Chinese products or product components. The burden of proof should be shifted onto the Chinese companies. By declaring any low-skilled, labor-intensive item manufactured in Xinjiang as potentially tainted with some form of coercive minority labor, Chinese companies that seek to export such products to the United States should conclusively prove that these products have no connection to Xinjiang. If they do, then relevant research teams must be permitted to conduct full and randomized authentic due diligence audits in Xinjiang's factories, villages, and internment camps. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Turkle.
Thank you, Chairman McGovern. Thank you, Co-Chair Rubio, and thanks to the other members of the Commission for directing the attention of Congress to the abominable crimes committed against Uyghur people in East Turkestan that China calls Xinjiang. Even as we speak, these crimes are tainting American consumer products. I'm here to urge Congress to strong action to end the unwittingly complicity of the American public to create a legislative mandate for much stronger U.S. government response to the ongoing Uyghur crisis by passing the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act without further delay. Forced labor is a deeply embedded tool of repression, punishment, and control in China. Over a decade ago, in 2008, the Uyghur Human Rights Project reported on the systematic program of coercive labor transfer that targeted young Uyghur women to be sent to factories in coastal Chinese provinces. The authorities used a combination of deception, pressure, and threats to round up thousands of young Uyghurs against their will. These programs had dual effect of separating families and placing Uyghurs in involuntary factory settings far from home. Today, we're seeing a convergence of the Strike Hard campaign of mass internment with a pre-existing state plan to relocate the textile industry to the Uyghur region. As documented in the recently published report by Citizen Power for China, new subsidies encourage companies to shift factories to the region. Government documents outline a plan to have at least 1 million textile industry jobs in the region by 2023. The manager of a factory known to use detained labor camps stated in a TV interview, quote, "With the support of the government, we have already recruited more than 600 people. We plan to reach 1,000 workers by the end of this year. We plan to provide jobs to 1,500 people by the end of 2019, end unquote. One of those workers reported that she got paid less than half of the minimum wage. She was also not allowed to leave and continued to endure forced indoctrination and was threatened with being sent back to the camp if she refused to sign a contract. We want to thank CBP for its October 7 withhold release order on goods produced by He Tian in a factory in the Hotan Vocational Education and Training Center. But it's extremely disturbing that US companies were still sourcing from the company until then. 2 weeks ago, baby clothes produced by He Tian were in the shelves at Costco. The company has now pulled these products, but it's hard to understand how the goods got to the store shelves in the first place, given how long this information has been public. But it is not just He Tian. US enforcement must step up the pressure that all goods sourced from the companies in the Uyghur region receive scrutiny commensurate with the extremely high risk of forced labor in the supply chain. Asphyxiating social control facilitates forced and involuntary labor. The techno-totalitarian system of surveillance, intimidation put in place by Xinjiang authorities means that any attempt to resist orders puts one's and one's family at great risk. As in the case of 2008 labor transfer program to eastern factories, many Uyghurs are currently being forced to work in factories under the so-called poverty alleviation program. Uyghurs don't have a choice. Refusing to participate in these programs could result in being sent to the camps. This is the same dynamic as in the state program encouraging marriage between ethnic Han Chinese men and Uyghur women, which has promoted and celebrated in state media outlet. Uyghur women's consent to these marriages must be assumed in the vast majority of cases given under extreme duress. If a young Uyghur woman to decline a marriage proposal from a Han Chinese man, she and her family could be labeled as extremists and sent to the camps. Uyghurs cannot say no. As a Uyghur individual living overseas recently described to the BBC that there's an atmosphere of horror. Quote, everyone feels like they've been watched all the time. There's a huge sense of fear. People tell me they sleep in their clothes because no one knows whether at night they might be taken away, unquote. Uyghurs outside of China are also subject to extraterritorial surveillance and coercion. Our latest report on this issue documents these ongoing and flagrant violations of federal law on US soil. As one Uyghur American said about being contacted by Chinese state security agents, they're telling us, quote, we're watching you. Wherever you go, still you are Chinese, unquote. Even though you're outside of China, it does not mean that they can't do something to you because they have your friends, children, parents, and relatives. Agents of foreign power are surveilling and terrorizing our own fellow American citizens with threats to send their remaining family members to the camps if they speak out about what is happening in their homeland. Given this system of intimidation and terror, both inside and outside of China, corporate supply chain due diligence is impossible. The complete secrecy surrounding the camps and horrific means of total control that is hanging over those who are not in the camps means that the free flow of information has been cut off to an extent rarely seen in modern times. No independent auditor or supply chain certification process can collect reliable information from workers, factory management, and local government. No interviews can be treated as uncoerced. Because due diligence is impossible, no company can provide assurance that products sourced in the Uyghur region qualify for legal import into the United States or any country that bans the import of forced labor products. If existing legal authorities are insufficient for Customs and Border Protection Agency to issue withhold release orders, commensurate with the risk of allowing illegal goods into the United States, Congress must act to shift the burden of proof to the companies that wish to import products sourced in Xinjiang or produced with the Xinjiang source cotton. I have some additional recommendations that I would like to share with you when time permits. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Mr. Posner.
Thank you, Chairman McGovern, Chairman Rubio. I want to first thank you especially, and Congressman Smith, for the leadership you've played on human rights over the years. when I was in the government, I was called quite frequently to come to various places in Congress to defend things that we were doing. We needed prodding then, and it was really, to me, a welcome opportunity to come up here, but not everybody in the State Department or the government views congressional appearances as their favorite pastime. This is a particularly important moment for you to be continuing to lead, and especially on this issue. All of you in your opening statements laid out the various things that you've done, both Senator Rubio, you in the Senate passing the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act, and Congressman McGovern Smith, what you've done, what you're doing now in getting the House to pass comparable or a different bill that deals with some restrictions, especially on technology. It's really important that you keep doing that, and I think the recent actions by the administration, the adding the 28 organizations to the entity list, the October Customs and Border withhold release orders, and the identification, although without names, of individuals for visa restrictions, none of that would have happened if Congress hadn't been on the ball. And there's more that the administration can do. You've mentioned the Magnitsky Act as one example. We need to name names. We need to not only pass laws, but we need to implement them and implement those regulations so that companies that are doing business and entities, leaders in that area, really feel the bite. So I just urge you to continue what you're doing. I want to say just a couple of words about what the administration's done. I'm often critical of the administration, and this is an area where I think Secretary Pompeo and Deputy Sullivan have spoken out forcefully and said the right things consistently, including at the UN General Assembly last month. Their words are clear. They are clearly concerned about what's happening in Xinjiang, but their words are undermined by the ambivalence of the administration, and frankly, it starts at the top. The president himself has been unable or unwilling to speak out forcefully about human rights in China, and it's part of a broader pattern. At the Group of Seven meeting last month, he referred to Egyptian President Sisi as my favorite dictator. In a bilateral meeting, he called him a real leader who's done some things that are absolutely amazing. He called the Saudi Crown Prince Salman a friend, saying he's done a spectacular job. He's pledged complete support for Brazilian President Bolsonaro, saying he's done a great job for the people of Brazil in all respects. He's praised Vladimir Putin as a terrific person. The list goes on. And it's not surprising then in August when he was asked about what was happening in Hong Kong, he said the people of Hong Kong and China are going to have to deal with that themselves. They don't need any advice. With due respect, they do need advice, they need support, they need help. People who are suffering human rights violations in China need our leadership, and that leadership has not been forthcoming. I'll give you one quick example. At the UN Human Rights Council, which we withdrew from, 22 mostly Western European governments together called on the Council to condemn what's happening with the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. We weren't there, we didn't participate. U.S. leadership is lacking in the world now on these issues at a time when it's more needed than ever. I want to just take my last minute to say a couple of things about the business community. I'm at a business school. Senator Rubio talked briefly about the NBA. What was striking to me last week as the NBA caught itself up in an unnecessary set of confused statements, they were debating whether or not a general manager of a team even had the right to tweet something. They didn't talk about the underlying issue. How are human rights and democracy being respected in Hong Kong? We all need, whether on the commercial side in government or private sector or private individuals, we need to recognize that what's happening in Hong Kong, what's happening with the Uyghurs, is of interest and concern to all of us. We need to be straightforward and we need to be stronger. In my written testimony, I talk a lot about surveillance technology. The so-called Integrated Joint Operations Platform in Xinjiang, which is probably the most pervasive surveillance program anywhere in the world. A number of American companies have been involved in that as investors and even in direct, and there's some examples in my testimony. I think it's critical now, and this goes back to something Senator Rubio said, it's critical now for the investment community, for the technology community, for universities to redouble their efforts to think about what due diligence really means and not involve themselves at all in supporting this Chinese program of surveillance technology that's being misused against this population. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Ms. Lear?
Chairman McGovern, Chairman Rubio, and distinguished members of the Commission, thank you for holding a hearing on this important topic and for the opportunity to speak. I've worked in the field of business and human rights for over a decade, which will inform what I say. My program has been focusing on both technology and forced labor in Xinjiang, and we issued a report today on forced labor in that region. Can I submit this report for the hearing record? Thank you. Forced labor in Xinjiang is unique, and it requires novel responses. Normal forced labor involves migrant workers who end up indebted to recruiters and have their passports confiscated, leaving them trapped in a foreign country. In contrast, in Xinjiang, the Chinese state itself is organizing the forced labor. Moreover, it's part of a broader effort to cut minorities off from their culture and religion and increase loyalty to the CCP through detention, re-education, and work. Forced labor in Xinjiang may indeed rise to the level of a crime against humanity, which I'm happy to expand upon later. At CSIS, our research confirmed and expanded on the work of others who have spoken today. Our interviews with ex-detainees confirmed, for example, that in some cases, both ex-detainees and the rural poor are being threatened with more detention if they don't accept work assignments. Both groups are also being paid far below the minimum wage in some instances, and the populations of the rural poor and ex-detainees are being mixed in factories. We don't know the exact scale of forced labor in Xinjiang, but there are some indicators. So for example, the government of Kashgar, a region of Xinjiang, stated that it would send 100,000 re-educated individuals to work in factories. That's 20% of the entire Uyghur population of Kashgar. Even if the Chinese government doesn't hit all of its targets, the numbers are likely to be very significant. Because some of the companies potentially involved in forced labor in Xinjiang are linked to global supply chains, action in this area can be part of the solution, although it certainly won't be sufficient. So what are the linkages? Xinjiang produces 84% of China's cotton. A number of large Chinese yarn, textile, and apparel companies operate in Xinjiang, along with many smaller ones. The sector's on the rise because, as others have mentioned, they're being subsidized heavily, including for taking in re-educated workers. In many instances, the companies operating in Xinjiang sell to other enterprises in China that further process textiles or other goods. The US imports over 30% of its apparel from China, so it's quite clear that some of Xinjiang's tainted goods are indeed entering our stream of commerce. But when we reviewed import records, less than 1% of Chinese shipments arrive directly from Xinjiang to the US, so it's a bit complex, the supply chains are. Identifying Chinese suppliers using forced labor in Xinjiang will require new approaches. For example, companies can't conduct their normal human rights due diligence, such as labor audits, because it's such a suppressed place, and our labor auditors actually don't have access to the region in many cases now. Very few ex-detainees are willing to speak about their experience because they're being terrorized even abroad. There are some red flags or indicators of forced labor that can be identified through online research. These include, I'll just give a few examples, hiring through government recruiters, language that mentions employing ethnic minority graduates, or companies that are getting certain kinds of subsidies, for example, for training supplements for factories in Xinjiang, aid to Xinjiang, and so forth. So where does that take us in terms of recommendations? As a starting place, US foreign policy really should embody our values, and we need to respond with an urgency that matches the severity of these abuses. As others have mentioned, the administration should apply global Magnitsky sanctions, and that could be to individuals that are heading some of these companies, for example. We do know that some of the companies involved in forced labor in Xinjiang have a US presence. And generally, I think the more we can pursue companies directly involved in abuses in Xinjiang, the better. And that wouldn't just be forced labor, but also related to technology and even companies that are building these factories and detention facilities. A federal agency, perhaps the Department of Labor, Department of State, should actually be funded to create a public watch list of companies in Xinjiang that trigger the red flags we identified that indicate a risk of forced labor. That would help CBP do its job, It would assist with global Magnitsky designations, and it would also put US companies on formal notice of the risks in their supply chain. CBP's approach will need to reflect, in terms of using the Tariff Act to seize goods that are produced with forced labor abroad, their approach needs to reflect the fact that Xinjiang is a police state, and so they probably are going to need to make some assumptions based on certain of the red flags we identified to enable seizures. Companies have a standalone responsibility to respect human rights, and so they should be carrying out human rights due diligence on their extended supply chains that come from China. And again, that means not business as usual, but actually much enhanced due diligence that will require new efforts and learning on their part. They could consider a ban on knowingly sourcing Xinjiang cotton as well. That's obviously challenging given the relationship between our economy and the Chinese economy in certain sectors, but it is an option. The US government itself should adopt our report's recommendations on using red flags and due diligence in their own procurement practices, right? Our procurement as a government is enormous. And last, I do think it's going to be really critical to work with allies so they adopt similar measures on global supply chains, because there's a risk that what we shut out here will simply go, let's say, into Europe. Thank you very much for your time, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you very much. I'm going to yield to Mr. Swazi first. He's chairing another hearing at the same time as this, so we'll go to him first for any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you, Senator Rubio, for your holding this hearing as well. I want to thank my colleague, Chris Smith, for his long-standing work on human rights issues, and especially for working together with me on the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act of 2019. I want to thank the witnesses for being here today. You know, you see the president on television with the leader of China, and it looks kind of like it's just another normal relationship, but there's really something extreme going on that you're educating the public about. And the American people do not realize, despite the reports in major periodicals and reports that you've done and people that pay attention, like the people on this committee, most Americans do not realize what's happening. And I sound like a broken record, but most Americans have believed ever since Nixon went to China that the more that China was exposed to the United States of America and the West, that they'd become more like us, that they'd adopt our way of life as far as capitalism, they would adopt our way of life as far as democracy and human rights, and obviously that just hasn't happened. And this is one of the most blatant examples of the way that the Chinese Communist Party and government treat the people. It started with the Tibetans, and we see it unfolding in the newspapers and on television in Hong Kong, but this is really one of the grossest examples of human repression that's taking place in the world today. And China, as it makes its efforts to become more and more of a global power, economically, technologically, militarily, wants to export its way of life to other people. And this is their way of life. This is the way they want to treat people, their own people. So I want to go to you, Mr. Zenz, where you talked about this as being an economic model. You know, when most of us have looked at this, certainly when I've looked at this, we've thought about it as being a way to promote conformity, to repress people, religious persecution. But you're saying that this is also an economic model. And if you look at the industries that are this forced labor is being used for, it's usually low-skilled, standardized mass production. It's not the future of high technology and things like that. This is a way to get cheap labor for standardized mass production. How much of what's going on with the Uyghurs, especially, and the forced labor that's taking place, do you see as being a way to get conformity and repression of a religious minority, and how much of it do you see as being an economic model? And I know this is not a precise thing, but is it a 50-50 thing, or is it 80% repression and conformity and 20% economic model? Well, how do you view that?
The primary goal of Beijing in Xinjiang is to secure the long-term power and survival and rule of the Communist Party. For a communist regime, securing power and ideological supremacy through labor is ideologically consistent. It goes hand in hand. I argue that the ideological goals are primary and the economic goals are secondary, But even so, the economic goals are very important because, as we have seen, economic success is now the main driver of the CCP's power in the world, the reason why China is powerful. And I believe they're extending their business model in Xinjiang. They're killing a whole bunch of birds with one single stone.
So when they're using this economic model, I think it's important for us to publicize the fact that, and I wasn't even aware of the extent of this until I prepared for this hearing, that how many American companies are using the products that are being produced from this forced labor in Xinjiang. So we see that there was a Wall Street Journal report back in May of 2019 that supply chains of Adidas, Campbell Soup, Kraft Heinz Company, Coca-Cola, and The Gap, and I see also, and I don't know where this came from, but it's in some of my materials that I prepared for this, that there's yarn reportedly entered the supply chain for H&M and Esprit, that there's also supplied clothing for Calvin Klein, Tommy Hilfiger, Nike, Patagonia. Is it even more extensive than the companies that I've mentioned that are using these products that are being produced with forced labor in these internment camps, re-education camps? Is it even more extensive than the companies that I've mentioned here?
3 points on this. The first point is that this is subject to further research, because it likely is much more expensive than we all realize. Secondly, Xinjiang produces 84% of China's cotton, and China produces more than a quarter of the world's cotton, supplying cotton to Bangladesh, almost half of Bangladesh's cotton, etc. Now we need to establish the exact dynamics of what all is made with forced labor, what is made with involuntary labor. But I'll give you one example. He Taida, who was just subject to the Customs and Border Protection detention order, days before this detention order came into effect, Taida shipped 1.2 million items of baby pajamas and baby sleeper blankets with the destination Costco, and Costco started and was gonna sell them and put them up on their website until they decided to pull it. I personally went to a Costco in Minnesota and asked about these baby clothes, and they said, yeah, we had them, but for some reason, we just got an order from management to put them off the shelves for now.
So, you know, it's important that we remind people that this is internment. People are being imprisoned, people are being tortured, people are being forced to do things against their religion, and they're trying to benefit from it economically as well. And the work that we're doing is to try and highlight this and have them pay for this economically. If part of their goal is economic, we want to really hurt them in their wallets. There are other things we need to do as well, but the sanctions efforts that we're trying to do to stop these products from coming to the United States of America are also essential. I just want to point out also that China is exporting these practices to other parts of the world, including U.S. soil. And there was a report in March of this year that a jury in Brooklyn convicted the head of a Chinese construction firm for engaging in a conspiracy to provide forced labor of Chinese workers working here in the United States of America, where people were working 14-hour days, 7 days a week for several years without receiving any pay. In the United States of America, in Brooklyn. We also have the U.S. Department of Labor announced that a Chinese construction company owed over $13.9 million to 2,400 workers on the island of Saipan, part of the U.S. Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. The Chinese construction firms hired to build the Imperial Pacific Casino Resort project engaged in reprehensible labor practices. They employed workers who entered Saipan on tourist visas and forced workers to labor for over 12 hours a day with no days off, ignoring federal minimum wage and overtime rules. And there's further ongoing litigation regarding worker safety and forced labor. China's goal is to become the dominant world power. They have a plan to do it. We need to look at what it is they're trying to accomplish. We know how they treat their people already. We know how they treat the Uyghurs. We know how they treated the Tibetans and are treating the Tibetans. We know what's going on in Hong Kong. And they want to export this throughout the world. So I want to thank all of our witnesses today for their excellent work that they've done leading up to this point, the research they've done in helping to highlight this to the American people. And I asked my colleagues here to work with us to try and get our Foreign Affairs Committee to finally put our bill forward on the Uyghurs to get this moving so we could join with the Senate, try and get something passed to help make this happen. Thank you very much to everyone, and Mr. Chairman, thank you so much
Thank
for
you very
allowing me
much.
to go.
Senator Rubio.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Mr. Turkle, let me ask you this. It's clear from your testimony that the horrific situation that Uyghurs are facing, they're facing it no matter where they live, as their relatives at home in the Uyghur region are either swept in the camps or live in an atmosphere of constant and pervasive fear. So Uyghur American yourself, if you feel comfortable speaking about this, can you tell us a little bit about how all of this has affected your family personally?
Thank you. Before I answer your question, I'd like to ask Chairman for permission to enter these two reports into record. One is by my organization profiling China's harassment activities, coercive activities, and the second one is about labor issued by a Chinese sister organization.
Without objection.
Thank you very much. First of all, Senator Rubio, I'd like to thank you for early on writing a letter to our ambassador, Ambassador Max Baucus, to ask for his help to help assist my parents. And two things that I thought that I was over with when I especially arrived to the United States and become U.S. citizen. One, I would never talk about my past history being born in re-education camp. After 40-some odd years later, we're talking about similar circumstance. And then two, I thought after becoming a U.S. citizen and licensed to practice in the United States, I should be able to speak my mind. That is not happening in full extent. The last time I saw my mother was when she was here in 2004 for my law school graduation. With all the efforts, including Mr. Posner here, we have not made any progress. My parents, my father's 80 years old, mom is 68. I don't think that I will ever see them again unless the Chinese government allows them to spend the rest of their lives here with their 3 American grandchildren. It's been difficult. I would be disingenuous for me to say that I have a normal life. I don't. I would love to go back to my life 2 years ago, even though it was a sort of weird, strange, difficult life. But at least I was able to check up with my family members, to say hello, congratulate them on significant dates. Because of this software that the Chinese government forced Uyghurs to install on their phones, the Uyghurs have been disconnected. Even testifying at this hearing may cost the lives of my parents. But it's the right thing to do. I have to speak out. This helps me to overcome the sense of anxiety, sense of guilt, sense of desperation, despair. Because speaking for the voiceless people is very empowering.
And I think anyone who hears your testimony should be troubled. You're a United States citizen, your children are United States citizen, and your family is being directly impacted by the policy decisions, the coercion, the repression of a foreign entity, and it's applying to you even here in the United States. And when people ask about this issue, it's about, first of all, this is not just about something that's happening. It's terrible what's happening over there. It's impacting people that live here on a regular and daily basis. And it's not just limited, by the way, to people with your background from that region who have family there or were born there. As we saw last week, the NBA has learned that you really can't ignore politics in China if you are doing business with or in China, because your business partner is the Chinese Communist Party. In the case of the NBA, their partner is the Ministry of Education. In the case of these corporations, and I think this is for the whole panel, the entity in China in charge of joint ventures and foreign companies doing business is the exact same entity that's in charge of standing up these factories and these different operations in this region. So if all of you could elaborate, if somebody's listening now, corporate CEO, members of the board, even prominent shareholders, who think that they could somehow make money in China, do business with China, but somehow avoid the political implications and or witting or unwitting complicity in what's happening, I want to give the panel opportunity to explain to them why that cannot be the case, why that will get harder and harder, both from a realistic perspective. I think, Mr. Turkle, in your testimony, you talked about how due diligence is impossible in this region, but even broader, there's no way to escape this. If you're sourcing from there, if you're doing business from there, particularly in the Xinjiang region, you are engaged in not just witting or unwitting complicity in these crimes, but you're engaged in politics, whether you like it or not, and you're now forced to make this decision between billions of dollars in revenue or not speaking out and losing it.
I'll say something right away. I would like to support your point, Mr. Rubio, with one further important aspect that you would have found in my written testimony. The linkages between Xinjiang and Eastern China are growing stronger by the day. So even if a company is doing business with an Eastern Chinese corporation in China or outside China, because of the mutual pairing assistance scheme by which 19 cities and provinces, including Beijing, Shanghai, Guangdong, and others, the biggest ones, the biggest business players, are mutually linked with mostly Uyghur minority regions in Xinjiang, especially southern Xinjiang. And by design and default, they're investing billions in the development of Xinjiang's minority regions. Now, this development, especially in the past years, has been predominantly to support the very business models that I've testified about, the 3 flows of labor. I have hard evidence that mutual pairing assistant monies have directly funded internment camp labor by constructing factories on the grounds of internment camps or right next to them, expressly designed by government documents to employ internment camp workers. And these linkages mean that China's entire domestic supply chain is becoming tainted. And the implications of that heavily underscore the very point that you have made, that doing business with China is not only a problem because the CCP in Beijing dictates what you can say publicly or not say about anything that they care about, but also because doing business even in Eastern China is now increasingly impossible without in some way participating or supporting the repression in Xinjiang.
If I could paraphrase, what you're basically saying is there isn't a single American today that has not either worn clothes or used a tech device that is not either funded or has been directly created by forced labor in China.
This is the trend because, as we speak, it's Beijing's policy to turn Xinjiang into the cheap manufacturing hub of the Belt and Road. Xinjiang is already the center of the Belt and Road. And this pertains to textiles, also to electronics assembly. It pertains to food products, all kinds of products. This is a long-term strategy, and this is increasing. Xinjiang's share in the manufacturing of cheap goods, as we have heard, because of rising labor costs in the East, is only going to increase. It's a long-term government policy.
Senator Rubio, just to add one other dimension, which I mentioned briefly in my testimony. There are a number of companies now that have been put on this entity list, 28 companies and government institutions. A number of them are private companies that have gotten U.S. investment dollars. And it seems to me one place to start would be to look at, there's a company called Megvii, another called SenseTime. We know that not only are private investment firms, let's say in California, venture firms investing, but so are public pension funds. In fact, the majority of dollars are coming from public pension funds, state, university funds. So this is really, I think one of the ways we start to look at this is to say, not only who's doing business, who's manufacturing, but who's investing. Here we're talking about firms that are involved in surveillance technology, facial recognition in Xinjiang. They're being supported financially by US-based investors who say, that's not I'm not focused on that. We need to focus. Every American business that's connected to that needs to be put on notice that this is now their responsibility as well.
One final question in regards to all this, and I'm not claiming this is what's going to happen. I think I know the answer you're going to give me, but I think it's important to have it on the record. How disastrous would it be if we wake up one day 6 months from now to news that there's some sort of trade deal and that as part of this broader economic arrangement, we have agreed in exchange for them buying more stuff from us to stop doing anything about this, to stop talking about this, to remove companies from an entity list. In essence, I get asked this all the time, should this be related to the trade talks? My answer has always been, you don't want it related to the trade talks because you don't want this to be something that can be bargained away in exchange for more agricultural product purchases or what have you. But how disastrous, demoralizing would it be on the global stage, not to mention the character of our nation, if somehow this became one of the items to be negotiated? And I'm not claiming that it is, but certainly trying to be ahead of the curve on this.
Well, I very much agree with your answer. Ultimately, this is a very important relationship, U.S. and China. We've got security concerns, we've got economic concerns. We have to make sure that the human rights concerns are not subsumed by those other interests. We have to be principled, we have to stand for our values. And these issues have got to be dealt with on their own terms, and we can't compromise them for other interests.
Just to quickly add to that, I also think U.S. leadership is so important because if we back off, especially on the technology side, right, we know that these technologies are being exported to other countries. And so when you just think about the world we want to live in and the role of democracy, it's just incredibly important. And so maintaining a focus on human rights, regardless of what happens with trade, is vital.
Just a final point that I would make as my time is up, although the clock keeps jumping around here somehow, I don't know, it's magical, but but it's a home field advantage, I think.
We're very liberal.
The point I want to make in just in a broader sense, the morality of this is clear. I think our national security and national interest on being outspoken and active on this is clear, but I would just add, just if you purely analyze this from a trade and economic perspective, how can you fairly compete? You're talking about outsourcing. I think, how can you fairly compete with a nation who produces basically free labor, compelled free labor, competing with your workers and your industries? So it's wrong morally, it's outrageous, but it's also, I think, the ultimate sort of violation of any sort of trade agreement you could possibly have that would be fair and balanced between two countries. So anyways, I mean, the more you learn about this, the more outrageous it is. It really is. But thank you all for being here.
Thank you. Before I yield to Representative Smith for his question, I just have a quick question. Just, you know, it was reported this morning that Cotton On and Target Australia have stopped sourcing cotton from Shin Jang due to the concerns about forced labor and human rights abuses. And so, I mean, I'm just sitting here listening, as we all are, to the expert testimony here today, and on the widespread use of forced labor in Xinjiang and the difficulties in determining whether or not a particular factory is using forced labor. And you know, you know, I've met with American businesses. We've had these conversations, and they tell me they've complied with all the rules and regulations that we have required of them, and they check all the boxes, but yet I don't really feel reassured that they know for certain that they're not sourcing from places that use forced labor. I mean, I just want to ask you, do you believe that the U.S. should ban all imports from Xinjiang? Ms. Leary, what would you?
Yeah, I think that's a hard question, right? So in terms of potentially CBP having a WRO that bans all products or all cotton from Xinjiang, it'll obviously have significant immediate economic repercussions. And I think the challenge may be, I think there's a problem with companies that, I think the Costco example is quite powerful, where they really should have known, right? There are situations where things will be many layers away in the supply chain, and companies may incidentally and unknowingly still source, right? So it's never going to be a perfect system. And I think the question is just, what's the fastest way to get us somewhere that puts pressure on the Chinese government? So it bans one approach. Another approach would be to start putting some of the larger Chinese companies on some kind of watch list, right? That's going to cause them specifically to feel pain. So a lot of the companies in the pairing program that Adrian talked about would probably make it on that watch list. And if anyone's going to sort of, to the extent you can put any leverage on the government, it would be them, right? They're big enough to do it. So I think there's just different potential approaches.
And I ask a question because based on some of the conversations I've had with U.S. businesses, you know, I mean, again, they can check a box, but I don't really feel that they're trying hard enough to determine whether or not, you know, forced labor is part of what they're producing. But so that, I mean, I just throw that out there based on the news this morning. Mr. Posner, do you have?
Can I just say,
Oh, yeah,
sorry,
sure.
very quickly, Mike? Yeah, I think they need to really step up what they're doing, right? Like, the normal way that companies try to figure out if they have forced labor in their supply chain doesn't work in Xinjiang. They've got to change how they're doing it to be taken seriously.
I guess my point is, we can lecture and we can urge and we can tell them to do this and say, well, why? I just don't really feel that they are. But, Mr. Posner?
Yeah, I was just going to add, you know, I think one of the advantages, one of the benefits of the Senate bill, the bill of the Senate, the Human Rights Policy Act, is that it required the U.S. government to report more fulsomely on what's going on. And one of the things that they should and can be looking at much more ambitiously is the use of forced and slave labor. And to the extent that they make that link to companies in the United States, that's the place to start. And my sense is we need to shift the burden of proof. We need to sort of say, if you know that things are being produced in forced labor in Xinjiang, then companies need to be absolutely sure that their products aren't being produced there. We need to make it easier to connect those dots so that companies feel the obligation, American companies and others, not to do business.
Mr. Turkle?
Yes, I would say in one word, yes, that's necessary. And also, we should also encourage other countries, our trade partners, to take a similar measure. This has to be a global effort. I applaud the Australian government for taking this step yesterday with those companies. They're even looking at others, such as H&M and other importers, to implement similar policies.
Yeah. Mr. Zenz?
Yes, I think at a minimum, the burden of proof should be shifted to the companies. That's an easy. That's a step that should be done. So there should be much more restrictive practice. But I actually do believe that a general ban on low-skilled, high labor-intensive manufacturing items from Xinjiang is actually not unfeasible. It can be done because we have such policy evidence, and we can continue to work on it, but we have such evidence that this is a systematic policy. In relation to the mutual pairing assistance, we have evidence of the funding being put into it. We have evidence on enough levels. I think this would send a much stronger message to Beijing than anything else, including visa bans on Chun Uyghur or policy acts, travel bans, etc. I think this would be the thing to look into, and I think it can be done if done properly.
Can I add one more quick
sure.
point? We've been looking at very different ways to address the humanitarian crisis and force the Chinese government to change its behavior. This is one of the ways that they may possibly change, because the Chinese government has not incurred any cost for their policies. Unless there's some economic, it becomes very costly operation. I don't think that they will change their behaviors. And also, by banning everything, we may be able to help Uyghur scholars being sent to these manufacturers to start their tooling technician life again, all over again.
Yeah, I'm just curious. I mean, the Target Australia, I mean, is doing. Why isn't Target America, doing it? I mean, it just. In any event, thank you, Mr. Smith.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for your tremendous testimony and your leadership. Secretary Posner, great to see you again. In the 1990s, I held a series of hearings and worked on this very hard on the whole issue of Gulag labor. And George Bush, Herbert Walker that is, and then Bill Clinton had this weak and inadequate policy of an MOU where they said, oh, if we suspect something is in violation of the Smoot-Hawley Act and is coming here, prison-made goods, we will then tell the Chinese to investigate, and within a certain time period, they'll give us their answer, and end of story. I went and visited two of the customs people in Beijing who were in charge of implementing that, and they were like the Maytag repairmen. They had no work. They said, well, we never get anything. We have enabled, perhaps unwittingly, over these decades, through very feckless and weak policies, the Chinese to exploit. And why would they expect there would be any real penalty now when the world looks askance, including, in many cases, the United States? So the Gulag labor issue has been with us a long time. It's now being implemented with great horrific consequences against the Muslim Uyghurs. So I say that as some background. But we do have some tools that ought to be more aggressively, certainly the new bill, bill hopefully will as Secretary Posner said, really increase that scrutiny and require a great deal of application of our laws. The Trafficking Victims Protection Act makes absolutely clear that this is in violation of U.S. law. That ought to be used. Yes, China is already a Tier 3 country, but there's a sanctions regime that has not been imposed. It was not imposed under Obama. It was not imposed because they were Tier 3 for 1 year under Obama, and has not been imposed upon a whole lot of countries. That needs to be brushed off and use those sanctions there. We also need, obviously, to use other tools that are at our disposal. So I say that, you know, we've got to just end mere words and rhetoric and concern, and now using tools, laws that are at our disposal. If any of you could give us best estimates as to how many people are in the Uyghur Laogai or gulags. For years, some of you know this, I know Secretary Posner, you know this, since my second term in 1983, I've pushed very hard on the issue of forced abortion and coercive population control in China, which is often implemented in a way in terms of discovery of pregnancies that were not agreed to by the government, children that were not agreed to by the government at the factory level. I remember John Avedon wrote a horrific piece about the rape of Tibet and talked about how it was an act of genocide as to what they were doing there. And when Rabia Gadir contacted me about a child, a mother carrying a child who had been rounded up by like 36 police in Xinjiang, I went to our ambassador, I went to the Chinese ambassador and said, "Are you kidding? All those people to destroy one little baby and to exploit that woman?" That baby got a reprieve and was born, but she was in the hospital being coerced to have an abortion. What happens in the labor camps when a woman is pregnant? Is she forcibly aborted? Does anybody know? Have we been asking those questions as well? So I guess I have a lot of other questions, but I don't have enough time. If you could speak to some of those issues, if you would.
Numbers of detainees? Yes, about the numbers of detainees.
The number of estimated detainees is, of course, of interest and relevant in terms of coercive internment labor. The problem with that is that the internment network is very multi-pronged, and much of it is heavy-handed on re-education. We have indication that one section of detainees are now sentenced to prison terms. Another part is being kept in intensive re-education because they apparently haven't been broken yet. And apparently the ones on their best behaviors are being put to vocational training, from which is largely re-education, but then eventually, if they are on top behavior, they can graduate. And I'm actually looking into some of this, so it's a bit premature to give more details. But we are looking at multiple streams, and the ones that most comply to the government are being sent into the factories for labor. It's very important to look at all three flows of labor that I've outlined in my research paper draft, because the involuntary or coercive labor issue goes far beyond the re-education camps. The training of rural surplus laborers, the official policy to set up satellite factories in every other village, in every second village in Xinjiang's minority regions, the co-optation of nearly all adults, including women, into labor means that we're looking at a scheme, depending how we define forced labor. If we define forced labor as at least highly involuntary at a minimum, we're talking millions of minority Uyghur and Kazakh adults. If we do it more narrowly as internment camp labor taking place in or near internment camps, we are getting smaller numbers. But the problem is these people are being sent, firstly, apparently, to forced labor right on the camp compounds or nearby in industrial parks that are right by, often with police accompaniment. But then, after some time, if they have behaved well, they can then move on to satellite factories in their own villages or industrial parks. So this is a successive scheme. We cannot only pin this on internment camps or even prison labor, which is also happening. The prison labor is a whole separate thing in itself. We need to track the entire development and related policies, and on a scale of coercion of labor, we are talking about a grand scheme that's encompassing basically almost the entire minority population, to an extent with the exception of the more highly educated. Some of them are allowed to just remain in government jobs, whatnot.
Can I say that?
Mary, do you want to?
Yeah. There are different numbers been put out. The most recent one was by Randy Shriver, the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific. He stated up to 3 million. Even if it's 1 million or 3 million, that is a significant number. Let's say it's a 3 million. That's 4 times the size of the District of Columbia population. So this city has been 4 times emptied out. That's the equivalent of that figure put out by the Pentagon. And those people have names, aspirations, and families. So it's easy for us to say million, 3 million, but the entire generation has been wiped out. They have a specific targeted age group, the people who were born in the 1980s and 90s. And as you may have known, that they have been collecting individual information based on travel history, past teaching, like Mr. Tape's brother, and also a social context. So the artificial intelligence gathered up these people. So when you look at survivors, when you look at the survivors' testimony or talk to them, some villages are completely emptied out. So the Uyghurs actually think this 3 million figure is a very conservative figure.
I wanted to just pick up a little bit on sort of the medical-related issues. We don't have anything very clear on specifically on forced abortion. We haven't heard very much, but we did interview a number of former detainees. And one thing we heard repeatedly that we weren't even looking for was people being subjected to repeated blood tests, repeated medical testing, often quite extensive. Women being given shots, they didn't really know what they were for. Not consensual, right, which is a violation of international law, medical testing without consent. So I think that's a whole nother piece that needs attention, and we just don't have enough yet to know exactly what's going on.
Is there any indications that organs may be the way they
You know, there are people who suspect it, but I don't think we've heard anything that we could confirm that with. Nuri, do you have anything you want to add?
No.
Okay.
If I can just add a slightly broader point, and it goes back to something Senator Rubio said when he asked the question about linking trade. All of the goodwill and good intentions in this room, both on the part of you all, but witnesses here, et cetera, pales by comparison to the direct relationship between our president and Xi Jinping. The Chinese Communist Party is a top-down, centrally controlled apparatus. He's both the president of China and the head of the Chinese Communist Party. And so on one level, the thing that is the most important is that there be a clear, unequivocal message coming from the top of our own government. That's what will make the greatest difference, and it's why I dwelled a little bit on my testimony, but there's such an obvious disconnect between what people in the State Department and these other agencies are saying and doing and what the president is saying. And so again, I know none of you have the ability to control his words or actions, but I think we need to keep our eye on that part of the relationship. It's a critical piece, and what happens at the top of the Chinese Communist Party filters down throughout the system. That's where the problem starts, and we're not going to really solve this until we have a more clear and unambiguous policy coming from the top.
Great point. Thank you.
Congresswoman Kaptur?
Yes, I want to thank our co-chairs this morning for just an excellent hearing and for all of those who have come to place on the record your very important information. The word communism is a very disturbing word to me. I come from a family where 2 great uncles, one died in one of Stalin's gulags, and the other one was sent to 2 of them and survived until he got out in 1952 after Stalin's death. And so the whole philosophy, Dr. Zenz, that you referenced, work sets you free, whether one looks at the Nazi Party or the Communist Party, this whole idea that somehow that forced labor equals salvation. I would be very grateful for any additional information you have from a philosophical standpoint about where this sick idea comes from. That's not really my question this morning, but I think that the victims of communism, you are onto something extraordinarily important that I think the new generation needs to learn. In terms of the impact of U.S. business relations with China. I'm wondering if, in terms of China's balance of payments with any country in the world, if any of you could state with which nation China has the largest trade surplus. In other words, more purchases from that particular country come from China than China purchases from that country. Could someone state which country purchases more of their goods than any other?
I don't know the exact numbers, but our U.S. Imports from China are number one.
That is correct. The United States. So if one looks at $500 billion or more of trade deficit annually, we are integrally woven into their practices. I'm wondering if you look at the purchase of U.S. debt, do any of you know which country purchases the greatest share of U.S. debt?
China.
I believe it's China.
Yes, it's over $1 trillion, $1.13 trillion. So what China does is integrally woven into the functioning of our society. And Mr. Tukel, I will do anything I can to help your family. I'm sure every member up here would. Just know that we stand ready to help families like yours. I would welcome you to my district to tell your story. If you're ever flying over Ohio, we would welcome you. We have a series we call At Freedom's Edge. Your family is a living example of it globally.
Thank you.
God bless you and God bless your parents.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask our witnesses, in terms of the gulags that you referenced, is there a gender difference? Are there more women working in these zones than men, or is it equal? Does anyone wish to comment on that?
Yes. The government has a quota for gender in textile, minority textile manufacturing, and it's supposed to be either 3:7 or 4:7. A ratio in favor of women. You also see that almost all the propaganda accounts in Uyghur textile manufacturing, especially connected to internment camps, show women.
So you're saying it's 4 men to 7 women? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, yes, for textile manufacturing.
Why is
There's
that?
of course traditional reasons, because traditionally Uyghur women, minority women, have engaged in traditional forms of cloth making, dress, etc.
All right. I'm reminded of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire in New York City, which spawned the development of the what was called the International Ladies Garment Workers Union in our own country, and the struggle that women have had globally, including here, to try to earn a decent living for the work that they do, many in very unsafe conditions and exploitative conditions. I wanted to ask you, any of you, what are the average wages? If you were to talk to an average American and just say, look, this is what America earns, American workers, what do Chinese workers earn working in these zones?
I can just give you a little anecdotal information about what the minimum wage is and what we're hearing people are actually being paid. So the minimum wage in Xinjiang is between 1,400 and 1,800 yuan per month. But in fact, what we're hearing is that both ex-detainees and the rural poor, who are part of these poverty alleviation programs, are being paid, sometimes not at all, sometimes being paid maybe 300 yuan per year.
Okay, what does that translate into in US dollars?
It's a couple $100s. The minimum wage would be, I believe, Nuri, you'll get this right, more correct than me, but a couple $100 a month is the minimum wage. But what they're actually being paid is just a pittance of that. So people are being paid in a year what they should be paid in a month.
I mean, we don't even know that. We don't even know what workers work for there. Is that hidden?
We know what the official minimum wage is, but there's an official government policy right now with regard to minority labor that they don't have to be paid it.
None of you place that in your testimony, I don't believe. If you could provide any refinement of that so that the American people could understand what's really going on here, I think that would be quite helpful. I also wanted to ask a question about fentanyl. In my district this past weekend, 26 pounds of fentanyl were collected by the DEA and several individuals were arrested. We know that that comes from China. Have you ever come across this issue in your work and where that's manufactured and how it gets here?
I don't.
No? All right, thank you very much. That ends my questions, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Senator Merkley.
Thank you all for your testimony, and to my colleagues from the House and Senate who are paying attention to this issue. Mr. Posner, you mentioned that it would be so important, central, to have a message from the top. And I am concerned that we haven't succeeded in getting President Trump to speak to significant human rights abuses around the world. The ethnic cleansing that occurred in Burma, driving 700,000 Rohingya into the neighboring country of Bangladesh, 300 villages burned down, massive systematic rape, assaults, and in this case, also again, a vacuum. And I think that all of us, Democrats, Republicans, House, Senate, need to try to find a way to have President Trump stand up on the international stage on both of these issues. As I was pondering the situation in the province, I was reminded of the movie Gattaca from 1997. And in that movie, there is a character named Vincent Freeman, who, because of his DNA, is assigned and categorized to be a class that can only do menial jobs. But he's determined to travel in space, so he goes to extraordinary lengths to basically overcome the government's systematic testing of urine and DNA. And this is really before we had DNA, ability to monitor DNA the way that we can now in 1997, and 20 years ago. Now we have this province that has an additional tool that wasn't even dreamed of in the late 90s of facial recognition. And Vincent Freeman would have had a very hard time overcoming that additional factor. I am concerned that this model of a government exercising extensive, massive surveillance in combination with artificial intelligence, with the data storage capabilities that exist at this moment, let alone what comes, is a tool that is very difficult for governments to perhaps resist. We have a case of our own government just saying that they want to take a DNA record of every immigrant to the United States of America. And so you can see that we're not immune from the collection of massive amounts of personally identifying data that could be used in all kinds of ways. As we're listening to you, I'm sensing that we don't have one clear path to be able to exercise more leverage. One of the issues has come up, U.S. companies, and how difficult it is for U.S. companies to track where the products are originating, and getting more difficult all the time, it sounds like. And how can we take that on? And if you all can follow up with all of us, we can think about what we can do legislatively. Senator Rubio led a bill, the Uyghur Human Rights Act, that passed on September 11th. And it has a series of reports and strategies in it. It has an amendment that I submitted that called for, unless international monitors are allowed access, it would trigger the Global Magnitsky Act. I do not know where this stands in the House, and if the House is prepared to take it up.
We're working on it.
Great, that's terrific to hear, because at least that would be one tool to draw attention to this situation. And I think as a result of the Senate examining this, the U.S. government, the executive branch, has now taken two actions on October 7th and October 8th. On October 7th, they set a series of export restrictions on certain products to a host of provinces in China that could be used in surveillance and so forth. And on October 8th, they put in visa restrictions on officials who are complicit in the internment camps, the slave labor, and so forth. I want to ask all of you, do you think there will be any significant impact from the actions taken October 7th, October 8th? How would you like to see the act, the Uyghur Human Rights Act, strengthened in the House? Or should we just get the Senate version passed quickly to try to get it to the floor to get it to the Oval Office, and then seek another bill as we understand more and have more defined strategies for applying leverage?
So we had a little bit of discussion of this earlier. I think both the Senate and the House bill have elements that are quite useful. The Senate bill, as I understand it, is more a reporting requirement for the State Department, which I think is always helpful. But I think the House bill also relates to sourcing restrictions and export controls, especially relating to technology. So elements of both of those, I think, are useful, and you ought to be pursuing it. The other thing I said in the opening is that all of those restrictions, while they're very much in the right direction, need to be enforced, and that you need to have congressional oversight. The companies that are doing the surveillance you talked about in Xinjiang in particular are Chinese companies. Those are put on the list in early October, but they're also getting investment support from American investors, and I think that's a place where there needs to be much more attention. This integrated joint operations platform that the Chinese are operating in Xinjiang is probably the most intrusive surveillance program in the world, and what you mentioned, facial recognition technology is part of that. It's really important that we pay attention not only to who's doing it, but who's supporting it. One positive thing I would say, we've talked a lot about what companies should be doing. One company that it really has taken the issue of facial recognition on in an affirmative way is Microsoft. They even took down a public facial recognition technology they had up when they realized that it was being misused in China. So there are ways to deal with this, but most companies are not doing what they need to be doing.
The entity list, I think it's very significant. I never thought in my lifetime that I would see a government would sanction the entire police department in the Uyghur region, which is very significant. And also, it's related to me. You know, that's the police department that have been harassing and intimidating my parents. And that's the same police department forcibly took my parents' DNA samples in 2015. So at personal level, it's very gratifying. And substance is also a very useful step. The visa ban is also a significant step, even though we don't know the individuals. As for the bill, I think we should pass a bill for now, and then talk about the other issues, make an amendment or introduce another bill with more teeth. The Uyghur people have been waiting for this body to do something legislatively to force our executive branch to take a coherent policy steps. So it is imperative that the pending bill, the HR 649, has to be finalized as soon as possible.
I would recommend making forced labor a separate issue and bill because it's a really, really big issue, even though it's related. I think it's good to pass what you have now so that that's passed. And I really suggest that a separate forced labor bill would be introduced because the implications are also, as Mr. Rubio pointed out, there's some very real business implications of making money off oppression and undercutting prices. I would really suggest that that would really have some teeth to scare the business community, the American business community, the Western business community, to really put sanctions on companies that have dealings with forced labor, and to make that a really strong, separate package. That would be my recommendation.
You know, it just makes me think there's a premium on us getting the Senate and House members together to get a strategy, because so often we end up with a bill passed in one chamber and not the other, and nothing makes it to the Oval Office. And certainly I'll make myself available for any discussions of that nature. It was mentioned earlier that China is a Tier 3 country in terms of labor practices, forced labor, enslaved labor. That puts it in a small group of very abusive countries. but the real impact of that is related to foreign aid, and we don't send foreign aid to China. So how could we take those same, how could we strengthen the Tier 3 consequences in a real substantive way so that it would have an impact on the types of practices we are seeing applied to the Uyghur community?
Well, again, to me, the biggest issue is enforcement. We had some discussion earlier about the Customs and Border Protection issuing withhold release orders on a few companies that were using prison and forced labor in the apparel sector. The enforcement of what comes into the United States has been historically extremely weak. We don't have the resources to get at that. And there's no doubt that there are many, many products coming into the United States that are products of forced labor. So I think part of this is really trying to figure out how do we bolster that and make sure that things coming into this country are not the product of the practices that my colleagues have been describing here today.
Well, we've also heard from you all how difficult it is to sort out the sourcing. And we have in Senator Rubio's bill a provision that is trying to open the door to international inspectors, but it makes sense to me that a piece of what we have to do is greatly increase transparency of the transactions taking place so we can track the products and apply pressure in an appropriate fashion. I want to encourage U.S. companies to do everything they can on their own to understand their sourcing, but if they're buying bulk cotton or they're buying, it sounds like it's very difficult to determine exactly all the roots of that supply chain.
I'd like to share a story. Recently, an Albanian journalist took a trip as part of the government-sponsored Potemkin village visits. In one of his interviews, he asked one of the happy-faced Uyghur minority individual if she was Muslim, and she was, in hesitance, told that she is not Muslim. With that kind of lack of freedom or coarse circumstance, it is inconceivable that any worker would tell the true side of the story, or real story. So it is impossible. I think that anyone claims, any company claims that there's a due diligence been done, it's dubious at best. It's impossible to accomplish that goal.
So even with inspectors or international observers gaining access, that doesn't mean that they can really tell what's going on in terms of testimony from people they're interviewing.
Chinese regime, what we can see from these organized tours to Xinjiang, has now had 2 years or a year and a half to refine their shows, as I would call them, putting on a show. And these detainees know if they don't play along in the show, they're going to end up in a much worse place than they are. I think it's extremely problematic to conduct any meaningful or reliable due diligence. I would still press for inspections because intelligent people can read between the lines. If you look at the BBC video on the camps, they did a fantastic job and made surprise visits later on and were able to record things spoken about 20, 30 feet away when the minders were chiding the head of the re-education camp about not having the right answer at the right time. But even so, I think it's much more necessary to look at this from what the government has said on paper. The Xinjiang government has made some very clear statements on paper. These ought to be taken seriously. I'm documenting them in my research, and I think it's much more effective to come to the conclusion of declaring Xinjiang an involuntary or coercive labor zone by policy or similar, go on that level rather than try to pick apart production supply chains, try to do investigations. One can do both at the same time, but I would really recommend doing the latter as well and not just the former.
Senator, the issue is much bigger than just the forced labor issue. I think we need to look at a broader industry standard. If we stop this practice in the manufacturing sector, we have the universities are vulnerable because we already know that one famous U.S. scientist, Professor Kenneth Kidd, assisted the Chinese public ministry with DNA sequencer sampling technologies. And also we have Winter Olympic is coming up. So this has to be a multifaceted approach. We have to also address the CCP insecurity. Earlier on, there was a question about CCP. To the Chinese Communist Party, the Uyghur identity, Uyghurs' religious background, in of itself is a threat. So they need to get rid of it. So this has to be looked at on the multiple fronts. The Australian example, I think, has a lot to do with this entity list. So whatever happens in Washington on this particular issue has a global implications.
Thank you all. Amy, did you want to comment?
No, what I was going to say is on a slightly different topic, which is just maybe another point of leverage that I think needs more exploration, which is the extent to which, maybe less in the forced labor realm, but with technology, maybe some of the large SOEs, state-owned enterprises that are building some of these detention facilities and factories, are they listed or are their subsidiaries listed in the US? And if they're involved in crimes against humanity, should they be able to be? I just think that's another avenue we might be able to pursue some of this from.
Thank you. Look forward to having my team work with you all on strategies that could be effective in increasing our leverage. Thank you.
Thank you. Congresswoman Hartzler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to my colleagues for holding this very important hearing, and thank you to each of you for your very, very important work. And I share Representative Capter's comments, Mr. Turkle, that we stand ready to help you, your family, any way that we can. I wanted to focus a little bit on Hikvision in Dawah. As you know, these Chinese companies have profited greatly from the surge in Chinese security spending, winning government contracts for large-scale surveillance projects, and they provided much of the surveillance equipment used by officials to monitor the ethnic minorities in the Xinjiang. On October 7th, 2019, the U.S. Department of Commerce, as we've talked about, have added 28 organizations located in China to the entity list, which restricts American exports to such organizations. And these companies, including Hikvision in Dawah, were added due to their human rights violation abuses in China's campaign targeting ethnic minorities. And additionally, in last year's NDAA, National Defense Authorization Act, I included language prohibiting the federal government, our federal government, and companies that contract with our government from purchasing Hikvision and Dawah video surveillance equipment. I have an inquiry pending with the GSA now to get a status update on the implementation of this provision. Mrs. Lear, what additional actions should the U.S. government and American investment firms take to ensure that they don't purchase or sell to or invest in companies such as Hikvision in Dawah?
Well, I think Mike has touched indirectly on this a number of times. I think there's a lot of work to do, maybe not just in terms of purchasing, but actually who's funding a lot of these companies that are developing this technology, and the role of both venture capital but also institutional investors in the US, our pension funds that are funding their work. And so I think I haven't thought of yet exactly the right mechanism to get at that, but first of all, just more attention to it, right? This is, I think, would surprise a lot of Americans. This is how their money is being used. How you get at it legislatively, maybe Mike has some ideas.
Well, actually, in my written testimony, I mentioned an investment firm called Amex, which specializes in high-performance computing for deep learning applications, and they've partnered with Hikvision. One of the things I think we have to really look at is who are the investment firms, and including the public pension funds, university endowments, that have a stake in companies like Hikvision and the others that are on this entity list that just was added to in early October. I think that's really a place we haven't put enough attention, and we also ought to look at university partnerships because some of this technology is being developed in conjunction with U.S. Technical experts who are working hand in glove with Chinese companies to build surveillance technology, facial recognition, DNA testing. So there's a lot of work to be done. There's a company called Thermo Fisher out of Massachusetts, which actually sold DNA sequencers directly to government authorities in Xinjiang for genetic mapping until it was publicly called out earlier this year. They stopped doing it, but how did that happen? What were they thinking? it seems to me we've got a lot of work to do just to map the field of where the investment dollars are going, how they connect to the kinds of surveillance and bad use of technology we've been talking about.
Divestment, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Divestment is one of the things that we need to look at. The Hikvision makes 1/3 of world's security cameras. There have been reports that the American Teachers Union have been invested in some of the technology companies being at question. So another thing that we need, I think this has, I always emphasize the global effort because Chinese government already tested out these technologies, surveillance technologies, by using Uyghur lives in their homeland, and now they're exporting it. New York Times reported that there are about 18 countries already in the process of adopting Chinese surveillance technology. The question is very simple: what kind of world do we want for our for the next generation? Are we going to be dealing with this kind of surveillance technology, monitoring citizens' activities, even if it's the mildest political opposition? Countries like Venezuela, countries like Sudan, Iran, and others have been already adopted these technologies. So that, I think it's a world a threat to the world that need to be looked at in much broader perspective.
Are you aware of any efforts at the UN to look at this or discuss this?
Mike, it's your.
Not meaningfully, no.
Okay. Anything else you want to say on the pensions investing, just other than that we need to? Do you have a way to go after that? I mean, I think that's a very important point from this hearing, is not just to target and to hold companies accountable, but to hold the pension funds and the investors as well, and as you bring up, the universities complicit in this.
I mean, one of the challenges we have in all of this, this is what I call the dark side of the moon. We're dealing with a place that's been essentially sealed off from public visibility. Independent journalists, diplomats, the UN haven't got access. So the first thing is we've got to find ways to get greater insight into what's actually happening there and who's involved. But then when we know, for example, on the issue of surveillance technology or forced labor, I think we need to be educating people in public pension funds, people in university endowment investment offices, and private investment firms. We need to set a new standard that says it's not okay just to say this is one of many things we invest in and we have no idea what they're doing.
Right.
If it's a company involved in high technology that's being used for surveillance or police enforcement, security enforcement, the presumption ought to be you've got to be assuming that it's going to be misused in a place like Xinjiang against the Uyghurs.
I just want to add one thing. I agree with Mike that this is the dark side of the moon. It's very hard to get firsthand information, but you can get some information. And so I think one thing in our report is the idea of having someone, maybe more than one person, fluent in written Mandarin, who's doing research in the US government and can start actually mapping out this world. It takes a lot of work, and the resources really need to be devoted to it. And then we, even without the access to the ground, we can still start to map this world.
Okay. And I wanted to close on my last question, following up on something that Mr. Smith said too, because I'm also deeply concerned about reports of forced abortions, forced use of contraception, and sexual violence targeting the female ethnic minorities in the Xinjiang detention camps. And there was a recent Washington Post article highlighting the story of a woman who had her unborn baby cut out of her body without the use of anesthesia. And there are reports of women being raped by Chinese guards, impregnated, and then forced to undergo an abortion while in prison. This is nothing more than systemic torture. And as a nation that values dignity and human life, we must shed light on and work to stop these egregious acts. You indicated earlier that you, none of you really have much knowledge about what is happening on the ground with this potential or the reports of forced abortion, sexual violence. Is there any more that you can shed as far as a light on this that you're aware of? And you know, could the forced abortion policy and birth control be part of China's plan to keep down the ethnic Muslim population Is there any documentation, this is part of their official state policies, and what can we do, if anything additional, as an international community to stop China's gross human rights violations?
We're speaking about millions of people being taken away, but we only have been able to speak to about 5 individuals who have been in those camps. At least 3 of those survivors have been telling us a very consistent stories about sexual violence. Mysterious pills that they've been given. Last month, I was one of the panelists at an event organized by the State Department, and one of my co-panelists who is a camp survivor told us that she no longer can conceive a baby. So because of what she's been given in the prison. And also a Washington Post story that you reported also describing very gruesome ways of sexual violence. But historically, Uyghur women have been a sexual object for the society. And now the forced marriage is another thing on top of taking away the Uyghur children. Every day when you turn on social media, you see a Uyghur woman forced to marry a Chinese individual. As you know, there's a large number of Chinese bachelors who are looking for wives, and the Chinese government providing incentives, housing, the cars, employment, as part of the effort to allure Chinese bachelors to go to the Uyghur region to marry Uyghur women. So it sounds like a typical, it fits the definition of cultural genocide. If a regime of government focusing on your children and your woman, I don't think I'm sitting with 2 lawyers here. You know, it's pretty obvious. There's a cultural genocide, ethnic cleansing is taking place that I am pretty comfortable stating.
Yes, I would like to add to that. Obviously, this is a very difficult topic to investigate, and official documentation on this is basically non-existent. However, the evidence coming out of Xinjiang, thankfully, is increasing. And just this morning, I read a new article of a testimony by Mrs. Sortbay, who was a re-education camp educator, forced to be. She's now in asylum in Stockholm. She has testified before, but I'm just reading a more detailed testimony of hers that specifically gives more detail on sexual abuse and details a particularly disturbing incident where several hundred re-education camp detainees were led into the courtyard by the security guards, and then one woman was forced to undress and was raped by multiple policemen in front of all of the detainees. And of course, Mrs. Sortbay, as being the teacher, witnessed this personally. And the purpose of this rape was to watch the responses on the faces of the re-education camp detainees. And those who showed dismay, shock, or looked away were then taken away for further punishment. Those detainees who did not express, who were expressionless and continued watching this horrific rape, were apparently being considered having made progress in their re-education conversion and were not punished.
Unbelievable. Well, we have much work to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Senator Daines.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Some of you might know I spent nearly over half a decade, in fact, on the ground working in China, in Guangzhou, back in the 90s. I can tell you I'm very concerned with the ongoing erosion of human rights across the region, everywhere from Hong Kong out to Urumqi. I appreciate the work of this commission. I believe it's critical that we address these issues going on in Xinjiang province and to bring more awareness to these forced labor camps, mass internment, and other atrocities going on in the region. The U.S. has been the global leader in human rights, and we must continue to lead. The Trump administration recently demonstrated leadership with the blacklisting of companies associated with human rights violations in Xinjiang and elsewhere across China. I'm glad we're here today so that Congress can continue to work to stop these ongoing atrocities. Ms. Lair, the administration recently took steps to blacklist 8 video surveillance and artificial intelligence Chinese companies, including SenseTime and Hikvision, due to their support of human rights violations in Xinjiang. Could you provide additional information about the role that technology plays in human rights suppression in China?
I mean, that's obviously a significant discussion. In Xinjiang specifically, a lot of the technology is being perfected, right? So it's almost like a place to experiment and fine-tune technology that's being used for social control. And then I think what we're seeing is how that's going to seep into the rest of China and also be sold to other countries. So the social credit system in the rest of China is sort of nascent still, but it is a way of really tracking people's lives in detail and either providing them with state benefits or denying those. Your ability to travel to another city, for example, could be influenced by who your friends are and whether they're considered problematic, whether you jaywalk. It's a level of potential social control that honestly is hard to get your mind wrapped around, but very significant. And we know, for example, in Xinjiang that people are being tracked for, how much gas they're using and whether gas usage changes, because that's seen as a signal of something. Whether they go in and out of their back door or their front door. I mean, it's pervasive in a way that is hard to really fully comprehend.
So the Trump administration has taken steps to blacklist 8 of these video surveillance artificial intelligence companies. Are you aware of any other Chinese companies or perhaps a key technology that were not included in this blacklisting that play a critical role in human rights suppression in the region? Maybe said another way, are there any others you'd add to that list of 8?
So off the top of my head, I don't have those names for you, but there are people who are researching that in a lot of detail, who probably could add some names. I imagine that was not all of the companies that have been involved in developing this kind of surveillance technology in China. Mike, I know you've been specifically focused on this.
Yeah, are there a couple others that the administration ought to consider? Mr. Posner?
I don't have a list of others. I would just add to what Amy said that I think we ought to view what they're doing in Xinjiang under what they call the Integrated Joint Operations Platform as a kind of predictor of the future of the social credit index. The government is trying to gather as much personal information, blood type, physical characteristics, movement. They've made it basically a suspicious activity to use WhatsApp or Viper, which are encrypted. They've said that if you don't carry your phone with you, that in itself is a basis for suspicion and can lead to arrest. So what we're really seeing is a kind of laboratory experiment using the Uyghur population as the test case or the guinea pigs to see how much information can you gather as a means of social control. So I think this is an area where we ought to be looking, and I think, as Amy said, others are trying to figure out who else is involved, but we also ought to figure out who are the people investing in American companies investing in this vast apparatus. I will say one other thing it's in my written testimony, but there are several places where I think Apple, which is a big American technology company, has done things that I have concerns about. I think they need to adopt a broader human rights policy. One is that through a partnership with the Guizhou cloud big data company, that company has agreed to store data on servers operated by the state-run China Telecom. And I think a company like Apple, big, strong company, needs to be highly careful about who it's partnering with and what their activities are.
I spent 12 years in the cloud computing business. In fact, I ran Asia Pacific for our company for 5 years. Be very concerned about privacy in terms of any data that's stored on servers in China.
Right.
The word due process doesn't always work over there.
Right.
I want to ask you, Mr. Posner, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has provided some of the strongest support to the Uyghurs at the recent UN Council meeting, stating that, quote, this is China's attempt to erase its own citizens, end quote, and requesting countries to resist China's demands to repatriate the Uyghurs. How is the rest of the world responding to the U.S. lead in this area and Secretary Pompeo's request for support?
Senator, in my opening remark, I gave praise to Secretary Pompeo and also John Sullivan, the deputy, both of whom have been quite outspoken, Sullivan, also at the UN General Assembly, held a session on religious freedom where he went out of his way to talk about Chinese violations. So I think consistently the Secretary of State and the Deputy have been very strong on this. My concern is, and I expressed it earlier, their words are compromised by the inability or failure of the President to echo a similar line. The notion that, for example, the Chinese and people in Hong Kong can figure out what to do about Hong Kong, that's not they don't need outside advice. Or the suggestion, which was reported by CNN and others, that he had a conversation with Xi Jinping where he said, while we're negotiating a trade deal, I'm not going to talk about Hong Kong. The world looks at the totality, and the Commander-in-Chief is the primary spokesperson for the United States. And if he's not echoing or even leading in the same direction as Secretary Pompeo, it sends at best a mixed message, and it allows somebody like Xi Jinping to say, I'll listen to the guy I'm talking to, the president, and I could ignore the rest. So I commend Secretary Pompeo. The challenge now is to get a whole of government approach, and it needs to start at the top.
All right. Thank you very much. I'm out of time here, but thank you. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate everybody here. I just have one final question. Senator Rubio referenced the whole NBA controversy in the beginning, and as you all know, back in 2016, the NBA worked with the Chinese state-controlled entity to open up the NBA Academy in Xinjiang. And I got a couple of, to your knowledge, has the NBA voiced any concern to their partners over the detention of Uyghur athletes? And the reason why I ask is because we know that Chinese authorities detained a 19-year-old Uyghur, a rising soccer star, for 11 months for, quote, visiting foreign countries after he trained and competed abroad. So I'm not sure what that is all about. They've detained a 24-year-old aspiring professional soccer player. He was detained for being in contact with his cousin who had fled to Turkey. And I've been watching this controversy unfold in the news, and I guess the benefit of this controversy coming to the news is that we're now focused on what's happening to the Uyghurs. Shouldn't take that to be able to focus our attention, but nonetheless, do you think the NBA should be even operating a training camp there? If they were here, I'd say, what the hell are you thinking? Right? Are you that tone deaf, or are you so interested in potential markets and making money that, you're willing to ignore the mounting evidence, much of which is, has been made public about the human rights atrocities going on there. As I mentioned in my opening statement, some have described what is happening there as crimes against humanity. And so it's like, well, let me, if anybody wants to comment, I just figured I needed to raise it because it's been bugging me. So if anyone wants to comment on.
Yes. LeBron James said that the Rockets manager needs education. Actually, himself needs to be educated about what's happening. Not only NBA, the other U.S. companies, McKinsey was holding a summer retreat in my ancestral hometown, Kashgar, last summer. All the media is covering the mass atrocities. So this needs to be looked at in a much broader sense. That NBA is losing its credibility. They have actual leverage. With this, I don't want to get into the history of NBA, but NBA is such an important entity, aspect of the Chinese people's lives in China. So if they can use that and the benefit of their own presence here in the United States or image internationally, this can be a very effective tool.
Just to add real quickly, at least press reports say that 10% of the NBA's income is now in China. There are 500 million NBA fans in China. They're estimating or projecting that their income will be 20% in the next 5 or 10 years. I think for a big company or big entity like the NBA, it's critical not to we're seeing a new normal where the Chinese government have said not only are what we're doing in Xinjiang or with Hong Kong is right, but you're not allowed to talk about it.
Right.
And the idea that somehow we're debating whether or not a general manager of a team is allowed to issue a 7-word tweet, leaving aside the merits of what he's talking about, means that the goalpost is moving. And I think a hearing like this, bipartisan hearing, is so important because we reaffirm the fact that these issues are very serious, they deserve attention, and we are in fact allowed to debate and discuss them. It's critical for American companies, if they're going to continue to do business in China, they've got to be able to recognize what their commercial interests are is one thing, but you can't prevent people from having a discussion about values, about interests, and that's really what the human rights issue is about.
And we should point out for the record that the controversy was over a tweet about Hong Kong, not even about what was happening in the place where they have their training camp. I don't know if anyone else has anything they want to add to that. I mean, I've always felt that, you know, while our businesses certainly want to be able to take advantage of the Chinese market, I mean, there's benefit to the Chinese government as well to be able to do business with us. And I've always been frustrated by the fact that, and this is the latest case, that they felt the need to apologize for a tweet from a general manager about what has been in the international news, you know, on a daily basis about what's happening in Hong Kong. I mean, it's like, you know, and I'll tell you, you know, if we can't, Speaker Pelosi always likes to use this line, if we're not willing to speak out about human rights in places like Xinjiang or in Hong Kong because we're worried about the bottom line or about money, then we really lose the moral authority to speak about human rights anywhere. And I think one of the powerful things about what you heard today is that there is virtually unanimity. Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives and moderates, all together, all are horrified by what is happening to the Uyghurs. And there's a determination to do something, more than just issue a press release, more than just hold a hearing. And so, you know, you've all come out for the legislation that is now pending in the House, and we in the House have an obligation to try to move this legislation that the Senate has already passed, that Senator Rubio has championed as quickly as possible, and other things as well. So I thank you all for being here, and this has been a very important hearing. With that, the hearing is adjourned.